Okay friends, one of the first things we have to do to get started on our job is to safely raise and support the front of the car so the wheel's off the ground. Do that with the body of the car, not by under the control arm. After that, remove all 5 of your lug nuts and then remove the wheel. With the wheel off of there, the next thing that we want to do is come over here to our lower ball joint nut. Go ahead and take off the cotter pin, remove the nut, and then we're going to break this free. The next thing we want to do is separate the ball joint from the lower control arm. That can be done a couple ways. You can either use a separator, which will of course grab onto the control arm and the ball joint, press up a little bit, and then separate the joint. You could also use a hammer, some light bonking. Let's go ahead and take our ball joint nut. I'm just going to start it on. With that nice and flat, I'm going to put a jack under here, apply a light amount of pressure, and then I'll use a hammer and try to add some vibration.
It's kind of in your way.
A little bit of pressure broke the ball joint free for me, but if it didn't for you, just apply a tiny bit of pressure, and then you can hit along this area with your hammer a few times to break it free. Remove your jack. The next thing we're going to do is go ahead and remove this axle nut right here. That way there, afterwards, we can push the axle through the bearing and we'll have plenty of slack to move this around. Remove your nut. Now we're going to lift up on the knuckle and set it aside. Now with the knuckle slid out of the way, the next thing I want to do is remove this bolt that comes across right here. There's a nut on this side. We'll remove that and then we'll push the bolt out through to the front. The next thing I'm going to remove is the sway bar link from the lower control arm. To do that, I'm just going to come right up inside this area here, being very careful not to damage my boot. I'll use some locking pliers to be able to hold onto the stud of the sway bar link, and then we'll go along the other side and remove the nut. The next things we want to remove is the 2 bolts that hold this forward arm to the lower control arm. There's one right here, and then if we move the axle to the other side, we'll be able to remove the other. So now what you might happen to notice when you're trying to remove the bolts that come from this arm to the lower control arm, typically they're going to be frozen in the control arm. That can be an issue. If you wanted to, you can try to heat up the lower control arm a little bit and then of course try to remove it, but typically because of the angle, it's going to reduce the amount of torque that you have to be able to remove it. For me personally, I'm going to come right up to this pinch bolt right up here, remove the fork from the strut right here, and then we'll be able to have a more straight shot to be able to get to those bolts. Now we're going to remove these 2 bolts right here. There's one there and one underneath the axle. We'll just go ahead and move this out of the way. Now we'll just slide this out of the way and we'll remove the other one. Now the next thing that you're probably going to want to remove is the bolt that comes through the lower control arm that holds it to the subframe. Before you go ahead and do that, you're going to have to get this transmission mount out of the way. We're going to remove these bolts and then we'll get under it and remove the mounting hardware from under there as well. Now the next thing I want to take out is this forward bolt right here that's on the subframe. With that bolt out, let's continue on to removing this one right here. Now from underneath the car, let's continue on to getting the other side. And then of course we'll move under here and remove the 2 from there. Come on. Now the next thing I want to do is start removing the forward mount. The way I'm going to do that is come right underneath right here, and I'm going to remove the 2 nuts from underneath. So now we're going to put a block of wood and start carefully jacking up on the transmission. Essentially, we just want this to come up high enough so we can go ahead and get this mount out of the way. Get this out of the way. Now the next thing I want to start removing is the bolt that goes through the subframe here and the control arm. It's going to come through from the front to the rear. I'll hold the front, remove the nut on the other side. Remove that bolt and remove your control arm. There it is, friends. Okay, now it's time to install our brand new control arm. Let's go ahead and slide it into place. Take your bolt with some copper never sees along the shaft area here and a little bit of red thread locker on it. Slide it through from the front to the rear. Start your nut on there. Now let's get our mount in here. Those nuts on there. With the lower hardware started, let's continue on by lowering our transmission down a little bit so we can start lining up our bolt holes for the upper points. Okay, so we're just going to bottom that out, then we'll take it a little bit more, make sure it's nice and snug, double check the other one, make sure that's snug, then we'll grab the nuts for under here and tighten those up as well. Let's let the tranny down, get the jack out of the way. Now let's get the nuts in for the forward mount. Okay, that one's nice and tight. Get this bolt back in, snug it up. Now we're going to install these two bolts right along here. So we're going to go ahead and put this arm together with the lower control arm. Now let's bottom both of these bolts out and then we'll torque them to 132 foot-pounds. Now we'll get this fork back on here. If you want to spray a little bit of copper never sees along this area, we'll call it your prerogative. So I'm just going to carefully pull down on this control arm a little bit so I can slide that up and on. Now let's put the pinch bolt through here. We'll snug it up and then torque it to 32 foot-pounds. Okay. Now I'm going to pry up on the control arm so I can put this bolt through this. Let's put the nut on here. We'll get the lower ball joint nut on as well. Start in the sway bar link. Start that nut on as well. And we'll snug them up, torque them down. Now we're going to snug up the ball joint nut and torque it to 43 foot-pounds. Once it's torqued, the next thing you want to do is line up the slot with the hole that's in the ball joint stud. If you see that the slot isn't lined up, continue tightening until the very next one does. Slide your cotter pin through, pin it over. So now we're going to skip right past this bolt and we're going to make our way to the sway bar link. Let's go ahead and tighten that up as well. Once we have it snug, we'll torque it to 29 foot-pounds. Now the next thing we want to do is continue on by carefully jacking up under the control arm. We want to bring this up so it's as if the weight of the vehicle is on the ground. Then we'll start snugging this up and we'll make our way to the inner bolt as well. Torque this nut to 119 foot-pounds. Now we're going to move our way to the inner bolt here. We'll snug this up and then we'll torque it to 47 foot-pounds. Go ahead and get the jack out of your way. Just be careful when you're letting this down. Now we're going to continue on to putting on our axle nut. You want to make sure that you put this on by hand and just bottom it out. After that, we'll torque it to manufacturer's specifications. The easiest way to torque down this nut would be to have a bar coming across here so it can't spin. Now we're going to torque the nut to 181 foot-pounds. The next thing you want to pay attention to is the slot area on your axle here. We want to go ahead and peen that nut down into the slot. That way there, it holds it tight and it can't loosen up. Perfect. Now let's get our wheel on here. We'll snug up the lug nuts, then torque them to 80 foot-pounds. Torqued. Okay friends, that job is done. All you have left now to do is go ahead and safely take your car for a road test down to your local alignment shop.